I have to get this pretty dishes popping right now.
Oh my gosh, do you know that?
It's electric.
Today he had a book. Okay, I'm not gonna finish this right. It gets terrible.
Yeah, no. So I bought the book.
Oh, I want to finish.
You know, oh my gosh.
So he's very he gets refused and I
Before you leave today, if you haven't signed in on the kiosk, that's how we know who was here. So please do that before you walk out today. As we start today and have Adam Compton with us today, I'm going to open with a word of prayer, and then I'm going to introduce our president, who will introduce our speaker. Let's pray together. Father, thank you for the opportunity for us to be here today. Thank you for bringing Adam and his wife with us to be with us today, Father. And we pray that you would help him as he gives his presentation and blesses us with his words. So we just ask that you would do a great work, Lord. We thank you that we're able to enjoy some good food while we're getting ready for this, and just ask for your blessing upon this evening. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen. President Mullen is going to come and introduce our guests now, and so I'm going to turn it over to President Mullen.
Thank you, Dennis. It's a privilege for Dr. Mills and myself to be with you tonight for this guest executive dinner. And before I introduce our speaker, I just want to mention that part of why we have the privilege of hearing from Mr. Compton tonight is that he and a number of other guests will be on campus tomorrow for what we call the President's Advisory Board. And this is a group of mostly alumni who act as a kind of consultant for the college. They're people that are involved in all areas of the economy, and they're doing very interesting things, and they help us to think about what it means to prepare graduates for those particular arenas these days. And also they share their experience of what it was like for them when they were students and what they think the world today is asking from you and from us as we prepare you to be effective in the world today. So I will introduce Adam in just a moment, but we have one other member of the President's Advisory Board here, Dr. John Riggs, over here at this table. And John, why don't you stand up? And he has with him his daughter, Kaylee Riggs, who's looking at Houghton. She's beginning her college search. So welcome, Kaylee. We're glad to have you here tonight. So over here we have Adam Compton, whom I will introduce in more full in just a moment. But I wanted to mention that Andrea Compton, his wife, is here with us as well. So let's welcome her. So Adam D. Compton is the head of investments for Merlin Wealth Management, a $2 billion family office platform at Morgan Stanley in Atlanta, Georgia, where Adam, his wife Andrea, and their 3 daughters reside. Adam previously ran a global long-short equity portfolio at the hedge fund GMT Capital for 9 years. He's on the board of directors for privately held First Florida Integrity Bank and its holding company, PGR Financial. Adam previously served on the corporate boards of publicly traded companies Alico and Atlantic Capital Bank. He spent 3 years as a bank regulator in Florida and 8 years as a sell-side research analyst at Smith Barney, Morgan Stanley, Bank of America, and Keefe, Bruyette, and Woods, covering the commercial banking sector. Adam was head of U.S. Financial Services Research at Alliance Global Investors in San Francisco for 5 years, running 3 portfolios, and has made several appearances on Bloomberg TV and CNBC commenting on the banking sector and financial services companies. He's also spent a year as head of finance for financial technology company SkuChain in in Mountain View, California. Additionally, Adam spent 5 years on the Investors Technical Advisory Committee for the Financial Accounting Standards, where he helped to guide development of improved accounting standards for banks post the global financial crises. Now, I'm going to stop here just a moment and ask, Adam, did you have any idea when you graduated from Compton in 1989 that you would be doing all these things over the next few years? Yeah, well, I say this because many of you in this room are going to have opportunities like Adam has had over the last 30 years? Yeah, I was going to say, I was trying to think what that would be. Yeah, 30 years exactly. And I would encourage you tonight to really ask him the kind of tough questions of what he has learned over those years that will help guide you as you seek to take the next steps in your pathway. I would imagine that some of you will be back here 30 years from now, giving guest executive talks to alumni in those days, and you might want to think about what your reach is going to look like. Adam graduated cum laude from Houghton College in 1989 as a business administration major, and I guess just about the time that Professor Bates was coming to Houghton, that's what I understand. And Adam also had minors in political science and economics. He then received an MBA with distinction from Cornell University. As an active volunteer, Adam has served on the President's Advisory Board at Houghton since 2017 and has also been a faithful member of Houghton's 1883 Society. And in case some of you students don't know what that is the circle of alumni and friends who year after year contribute to the college that helps support you being here. So please join me in welcoming Mr. Adam Compton.
Thank you, Dr. Mullen. I definitely appreciate the introduction. She didn't tell you my other claim to fame, which is I dated Kim Kerr before she was Kim Kerr Pagula, so you could thank me for breaking up because Houghton got a lot more donations because of that.
I actually didn't know that. That's very interesting.
That was my attempt at humor. There you go. Just to gauge the room, how many of you are here because you want to be here? Pretty good. How many are here because you felt like you had to be here? Dr. Mullen raised her hand on that. How many of you are here because you heard the food was better? Yeah, no, it's the same stuff. So, all right, just checking things out before I start. So, what I want to do is really be useful to you guys and share whatever thoughts I can. When I originally talked to Carl over in development, he was like, well, spend a lot of time helping students understand what employers are looking for or how they should go into interviews. And I thought about that, but also like, I don't know that I'm the best resource on that. So I think what we kind of ended up at was, you know, hopefully some useful information for you guys talking about two things on the micro side. One is things I wish I knew while I was at Houghton. So sort of if I go back in a time machine, like what would I focus a little bit more on? And then the other way to think about things is things I wish, things I would like to know if I was at Houghton now, right? Because you actually live in a much different world 30 years later at Houghton than I did, so I think I need to take that into account. And hopefully there's some useful information I can provide for you that way. What I'm also going to talk about is things I probably am a little bit more knowledgeable on, or hopefully a little bit more knowledgeable on. I'm going to spend some time talking about the global over-reliance on central banks and monetary policy. I think it's a problem in the economies, the big economies around the world right now, and it's one, as an investor, I have to spend a lot of time paying attention to and kind of understanding the implications for all the different asset classes that I'm participating in. And kind of along with that, I did want to touch on the long-term implications of negative interest rates because, again, you guys live in a much different world than I did 30 years ago, and something that was never thought of back then was negative interest rates. It's starting to spread globally right now, and it actually has really important and substantive implications for how a lot of businesses, profit or non-profit, operate over time. So things I wish I knew when I was at Houghton, you know, I'm sure you come into a lot of these things and people want to try to give you useful information, probably a lot of it you tune out, but really, honestly, like if I could go back, like how would I allocate my time. I got good grades while I was here, so, you notice the bottom line there, don't be afraid to fail. I'm not talking about your classes, so, but don't be afraid to fail is more take chances, and it's okay to be wrong once in a while. And honestly, that's something I probably didn't learn enough while I was here and through life since then, going out and taking chances, just trying things. Whether you think you can get through it or not, the only way you will actually achieve a lot of things is by trying them and not being afraid of failure. But first off, I have to build connections with people. I don't mean add a bunch more people on your Facebook account. I mean talk face to face with people, get to know people, because it's really one of the important things that you carry with you through your life. I was talking to I think of him as Coach Lord, but Skip Lord, earlier, and there's a lot of friends and friendships that I built here at Houghton that I still treasure and that I think really carried through my life even 30 years later. So, and these are people I still call when I have a concern. These are people I write to when I would like some prayer on an issue. So these things are important, and make sure you spend the time to build the connections with people while you're here, while you're still getting good grades. Build your relationship with God, explore your faith. I think a lot of people come here having spent a lot of time in church and having faith kind of directed, not everybody, but I grew up in a very church-heavy household where we went every week, twice a week, and the good news is that gave me a good background. The bad news is I probably didn't question enough going into my time here. So take your time here, and as you leave Houghton, to assess your faith, and because when you look at it and assess it, inevitably it should be stronger at the end of the day. And there will be times in your life where it's harder, and there will be times in your life where it's easier, but it will always be important. So just continue to build your relationship with God. Enjoy your natural surroundings. I know I didn't go to Letchworth enough days here. I love going to parks now. I spent the entire day hiking yesterday at Letchworth. It seems like it's hard to take the time out to do things like that when you're busy with class, worried about papers, worried about how you're going to pay the bills. But it is something in life that you will truly, if you don't already appreciate it, you will come to appreciate spending time on things like that and see how beautiful a world God has built for us. So the consistencies, hopefully, between all these points these are the things that really matter over time. It's not what grade you got on your econ exam, although that's important. It's not what you're going to remember 30 years later. It's going to be the people you make connections with and the strength of your relationship with God. So things I would like to know if I was at Houghton now. So again, you guys are in a very different world than I was 30 years ago. I don't actually envy you at all. The world's changing really, really rapidly right now. And I always think, am I getting older or are things changing faster? The answer is both. I am getting older. But there's really an acceleration in the rate of change globally in so many different things. A lot of that's driven by technology. I think you can spend 4 years here trying to perfectly position yourself for a career that may not exist in a decade, and I absolutely believe that. One thing I'll just touch on briefly, AI, I know people talk about it, but it will dramatically change the job market over your lifetime. Just as an example, I used to be a major investor in Citibank. I spent a lot of time with Bob Rosetta, who runs the resource allocation at Citibank, and we went through the numbers a couple of years ago on what AI can do just as it exists today on their workforce. And they have a workforce footprint, which would include employees plus consultants plus outsourced employee footprint. It's over 200,000 people, and the numbers he went through were that in 5 to 10 years, they could take out a third of the workforce very easily by taking tasks that AI was capable of replicating faster and more accurately than humans. So, you could train for a job and think you have your career all the way planned out, and it can go away really, really rapidly. So you need to think about what can you take with you from Houghton that will actually endure all the changes that you're about to go through, over the next few decades. And that really goes back to learning critical thinking and becoming a lifelong learner. That skill set doesn't go away because it basically enables you to adapt over time. being a critical thinker and being a lifelong learner is also the path to being a responsible partner, a citizen, and a community member, no matter what you're doing. If you're not out there looking at the information that's available, making informed decisions, then you're effectively not going to be participating in a way that helps your community grow over time. Read voraciously. You will not survive the world out there unless you're reading constantly to understand the changes that are going on. And importantly, in a world where there's so much information available now, understand the context in which things were written and information was created, explore alternative viewpoints, but still reach decisions, and understand you're going to be wrong sometimes. I think one thing I had to learn through my career, especially on investing, if you're getting 60% of the things right in the investing world, you're making a lot of money for your clients, but that also means that 40% you have to understand where you were wrong and just let it go, because you're not going to be right all the time. And I think that's true in a lot of careers. You have to understand you're going to be wrong sometimes. How do you deal with that, and how do you minimize the effect of that over time? So know your own limitations, really. So I'm going to switch gears to macro. This is probably a lot less interesting in some ways to you guys because it may be a little bit more esoteric, but this is the kinds of things I focus on a lot, and hopefully are things that I could give you some insights that you might not otherwise been able to get. So as I mentioned before, I want to talk about the current over-reliance on central banks and monetary policy and the economies globally, and the implications of negative interest rates as the practice of quantitative easing spreads. So what is a central bank? I threw this one in at the last minute because not everybody may spend a lot of time trying to understand what central banks actually do. So really, you have in the United States the Federal Reserve, also known as the Fed. In Europe, you have the European Central Bank, the ECB, although a lot of the individual countries still have central bank operations there too. In Japan, you have the Bank of Japan, and other examples are like the People's Bank of China, PBOC. What do? They control the money supply. They're responsible typically for banking system stability, and generally have mandates like maximum employment, stable prices, and moderate long-term interest rates. And those mandates can conflict. So when did the over-reliance on central banks and monetary policy start globally? Really, it started in Japan with zero interest rate policy in 1999 after the boom-bust cycle of the 1980s and 90s. Remember when I was here in the business program at Houghton, we spent a lot of time on Japanese management techniques because Japan had this amazing blossoming of their economy in the 1980s. Part of that, at least, was attributed to the fact that the Japanese had these great management techniques, and some of it was due to that. A lot of it was actually due to just expanding debt load in the Japanese economy and a banking system that really created an over-reliance on credit, which is a common theme that I'll go through a couple times here. So Japan really has never recovered from that. They didn't clean up their banking system. When you don't clean up a banking system post a crisis, it tends to create a very long period of very minimal growth. So Japan has experienced that even since this period, and really I would say the EU has actually experienced that since the great financial crisis in 2008, 2009. The US actually has engaged in what I would call a zero interest rate policy or quantitative easing. Post the great financial crisis, they did start to back out of it. They're stopping right now, given some slowing in the US economy, but you're actually having a case where the EU is now aggressively shifting back towards quantitative easing, which goes back to an over-reliance on central banks and monetary policy in driving the global economy. So I'm not sure how well you could see this up here. You probably can't see the numbers on the side, but effectively, since 2009, the assets of the central banks, the four biggest central banks globally, which would be the US Federal Reserve, the PBOC, the Bank of Japan, and the ECB, have grown from about $5 trillion to about $20 trillion. So this is effectively the result of these banks going out and buying assets and holding them, typically bonds, first government bonds, but then once they absorb enough of the government bonds globally, they've moved to corporate bonds. They keep expanding out the different asset classes. You'll notice this graph sort of leveled off over the last couple of years. That's really because the US shrunk its balance sheet some during that period. At the Federal Reserve, the ECB had kept theirs flat, same thing at Bank of Japan. But what you will see now, going off the right end of this over the next probably at least 2 to 3 years, if not longer, is it's going to start expanding again. Just 3 weeks ago, the European Central Bank had its meeting, and the departing president of the ECB, Mario Draghi, basically said, quantitative easing is back on again. We're going to start aggressively buying assets and further expanding the balance sheet of the European Central Bank, because they're facing, in their projections, a period of several years of no growth and very minimal inflation. So why is this happening? Part of it is a function of very ineffectual or a complete lack of fiscal policy efforts by governments, and general political dysfunctions globally in the governments. If you think about sort of what drives the economy, it's commercial activity, but it's also fiscal stimulus by the government and monetary stimulus by the central banks. So fiscal stimulus, example of fiscal stimulus would be going out and building a bunch of highways, or the heavy investment in infrastructure we saw in the 1930s post the Great Depression. So that would be an example of fiscal stimulus. Monetary stimulus is exactly what the Fed does, as far as first lowering interest rates in order to stimulate the economy, but which has been taken to extreme with the act of actually purchasing assets aggressively to try to bring inflation back into the economies. Another big factor that I'm actually going to touch on is shifting demographics globally. Probably the greatest examples of this are Germany and Japan, but you have actually shrinking populations and aging populations, and when you do that, just the math is it's very hard for an economy to grow. And last thing I'm going to mention again is the rapid pace of technological change. The digitization of information and improving market efficiencies are driving price deflation on many products and services globally. We could go back to how it was 30 years ago when I was here, but there were no smartphones, there was no Amazon, and information flow was much, much slower. Even when I first started in the investment business, most of my information gathering was done literally by documents sent through the mail. So I would go and collect a big pile of mail every day and try to read through it. You usually got it 3 weeks to 3 months after it came out, so the pace of information flow was incredibly slow. These days I sit on a Bloomberg terminal, I literally have news feeds from every major news source globally, I have every data set on every economy globally, and I can see all the data in real time, so it's kind of switched from a world where information flow is slow to a world where information flow is actually kind of overwhelming, and the most important part of your job is narrowing down your information flow to what's useful as opposed to trying to go find it all. Just to go through the demographics, again, hopefully you can see this some, but you can see here the population of Germany actually peaked at the last decade, and the percentage of the population age 65 and over is heading up over time. And again, if your population is shrinking and your average age continues to go up, paying for expansion of the economy is very difficult because you're actually spending more and more of your money paying for services and for safety nets for the elderly of the population. That's not a bad thing, that's a good thing, but the math gets harder the more your population ages on average over time. So this is a problem in Germany, this is a problem in Japan, with very similar numbers. So we're faced with a world that's very different. From when I was born, a lot of the worries globally were that population growth was too high, that we'd never be able to support the food infrastructure needed to feed everybody. And we're actually shifting to a world where the problem is not, in some countries it still is, but for the majority of the world's population, the problem isn't getting enough food to people, it's dealing with people who have plenty of access to food and have related problems like diabetes, et cetera, from poor nutritional intake as opposed to getting enough actual intake. Just technological change in perspective. As I mentioned, the markets for products and services are becoming what I would call hyper-efficient, because the information on prices and availability have become very cheap, ubiquitous, and instantaneous. So you all probably take it for granted that you could walk into a grocery store, see a product, see what the price is, but then you could also look it up on Amazon and see if you have better options and have it delivered to your door tomorrow. That world definitely didn't exist even 10 to 20 years ago. And what that does is it creates incredibly efficient markets where the price and the volumes will all migrate to the lowest cost provider because so many different products become commoditized by the available information of cheap, ubiquitous, and instantaneous information. So, you know, that's all been enabled by the advances in information technology over the last 40 years. That's enabled this, and it's unlikely to stop. You know, I'm sure you've heard numbers like this before, but the iPhone in a lot of your pockets actually can process about 120 million times faster than the computers they used to send them into the moon. So it's a world where information technology has done an amazing job of becoming faster, cheaper, at an unrelenting pace. You may not have noticed this last week, and unless you're a bit of a technology geek like me, but there was some news articles on the fact that Google had reached what's called quantum supremacy on a quantum computer that they had built, and what that really means is they were able to create a calculation that they were able to do so much faster than any of the best supercomputers in the world today, that it sort of creates a huge imbalance in computing power. So in that case, if you took the best supercomputer in the world today that's not a quantum computer, and you gave it the task that this computer approached, it would have taken it over 10,000 years to calculate. The quantum computer that Google was able to build, although it was purpose-built and very specialized, so take this with a grain of salt, was able to do it in 3 minutes and 20 seconds. Implications of that are pretty stunning from the standpoint of security. If you think about security in most banks and IT systems globally, they're based on encryption. Encryption is all about having computing power that is quantifiable, because any system can be broken from an encryption standpoint if you have enough computing power and time. If you get a differential in the computing systems as big as can be created with usable quantum computers, which we're not there yet, but it will come, it's going to create huge imbalances, and that's just an example of the fact that technology and the pace of technology change are something that's likely to go away. So what happens to asset prices and markets in extreme intervention by central banks? First, the markets are pushed out the risk spectrum, which does stimulate economic activity for a while. So why do central banks do this? Why do they go out and buy assets? And why do they start by buying government bonds? Well, what this does is, if you go out into the market as a central bank and you buy the government bonds, you're taking a low-risk asset out of the system, you're putting it onto your balance sheet, and you're putting cash out there. As you do that, it drives up the price of that asset, it drives down the yield on that asset. So effectively, there's less of those assets out there. The ones that are out there are at less and less attractive yields over time. So essentially, the incentive to own a treasury bond goes away. Or if you're in Germany, the incentive to own a 10-year German Bund goes away, because the yield essentially disappears. And in the case of the 10-year German Bund, actually goes negative. So when that happens, you have dollars sitting around. You're like, what do I do with it now? If you're an insurance company, if you're an investment firm managing retirement funds, you have to go out and take that low-risk asset and buy something else with it. So what that does is create a situation where you push people out the risk spectrum, and then as you do that, it actually drives those asset prices up and drives the yields and the returns of those assets down. So this sort of creates these concentric waves of buying in assets farther and farther from the low risk out to the high risk. That does stimulate the economy, and for a while it does create some economic activity, which again is why they do it. But what also happens is the asset prices eventually become a direct result of central bank activity, and for the investment world, what's the intrinsic value of those assets anymore? I'm not sure, because what's a German boon worth to me. Certainly not a negative yield, but if I think the central banks are going to continue to buy them, and I can't find any other assets at that risk point and that kind of duration that I need for my business, then I'm kind of left with a bad decision set of, do I buy boons and hope the price continues to go up and the yield goes more negative, or do I go out and buy something else where there's more risk than I otherwise want to handle? So the market distortions eventually create extremes like negative interest rates, as I pointed out. So here's a slide that demonstrates that really visibly. Effectively, the negative yielding investment grade debt globally was 0 until late 2014, and then you actually had enough government buying into the investment grade debt market that it created a lot of assets with negative yields. So, we shot way up to 10 trillion. It ran sideways for a while through 2017, 2018. And then into this year, we've actually seen points of over 17 trillion in assets with negative yields globally. And to keep that in perspective, that's 17 trillion is roughly the size of, somewhere in the EU, US economic output annually. I think US is more like 19 trillion right now. The EU is about 17 trillion. So effectively, you have all these assets globally that are being driven to negative yields by what the central banks are doing. So implications of negative interest rates. To think about sort of how does the system work with negative interest rates. And again, you probably haven't spent a lot of time in class talking about negative interest rates and what does that mean. But for a bigger and bigger part of the world, they're actually living in a world where they have to deal with those kinds of questions. A great example of that is Denmark right now has very negative interest rates across their financial system. So go out and Google Denmark negative interest rates, kind of see how people are trying to learn how to deal with that. But it has to me, sort of as an investor and as a person who cares about long-term sustainability, to me there's a lot of problems with negative interest rates. First is the impetus to limit or pay down debt disappears, so you're just going to get more debt on the market. If people are actually rewarded for taking on debt instead of penalized for taking on too much debt, then people will react, or entities will react in accordance with the incentive system. Asset price distortions spread to other markets. So this doesn't just affect the debt markets. Equities certainly get affected. If bonds don't have attractive yields given their particular risk points, people will eventually shift some of their assets to equities. It probably causes some overpricing in the equity markets eventually, and in other big asset classes like real estate. One of the negative things I think about a lot are sort of populations in the world globally that are relying on investment income, which would include retirees. If you're a retiree and you saved your whole life, and you had some expectation of having an income stream off of the money you had saved up, that effectively goes away at negative interest rates. You're actually penalized for trying to hold the money. So, in that kind of situation, we may be left with retirees who are a lot more reliant on the government safety net, which I don't, view as a positive, and just certainly something to think about. There's a lot of business models that are built on an assumption of positive yields, and these eventually become untenable. If you think about corporations or even nonprofits with significant pension obligations, they'll actually largely become insolvent. Most pension funds are set up, again, with an assumption that you put some money away and that it earns a return over time, and then you have built into that expectations of how long people will be in retirement, how long they'll be alive, and what their costs are. As soon as you take away the expectation of the positive return on the money you're saving for a pension system, again, a lot of companies are going to be instantly insolvent, and it kind of pushes the world towards, again, being more reliant on government safety nets. So, for me, I view that as pretty negative. Financial intermediaries, well, so again, I'm a banking expert, so I tend to focus on this area, but for most financial intermediaries, they're going to be unable to generate profits for a while. I think most banks and property casualty insurers would probably face 4 to 5 years of little or no profits, because their business models are again built around having deposits, paying money on those deposits, making loans, and hopefully making more money on the loans than they paid out on the deposits. But inverted yield curve and negative interest rates will all sort of make that very untenable, and you'll actually have to see banks charge you for holding money at the bank, which again goes back to a distorted incentive system. Why are people going to save if you're penalized for keeping money in the bank? So, you know, for property casualty insurers, you know, part of their calculus on how they charge for risk is how much money can they make on investments during the 3 or 4 or 5 years of risk that they're covering in their policy. So they will have quite a few years of difficulties too in a negative interest rate environment. The really most hurt business models are actually going to be life insurers, because life insurers actually take on, you know, in general 30, 40-year liabilities where they agreed with you to pay a certain amount each month or each year for the life insurance policy. They had an assumption of making a return on the money you're putting away and then paying out when you pass away on the life insurance policy. Negative rates over 30 or 40 years, when they didn't build that into the original assumptions, means that the life insurance businesses go away. I mean, effectively, all life insurers should be something close to bankrupt is the way I think about it. Will we have negative interest rates in the United States? We don't right now, but we had 10-year Treasury yields down to 1.4% just about a month ago, so we're not that far off. They do have negative yields in Europe. Bonds are fungible, so on some level, cash flows and competition against those bonds will bring U.S. rates down some. You know, we do have less dire demographics in the U.S. We don't have a shrinking population. Our economy is doing a bit better than Europe. And the other thing I think should help the U.S. a lot is we did pretty rapidly clean up the U.S. banking system post the global financial crisis. It's something Japan never did post their crisis, and that's something that the EU never really did post the global financial crisis either, which is, I think, a big reason on why they continue to struggle along. You know, long-term issues for the economies using QE seem to outweigh short-term benefits. The Federal Reserve, I think, recognizes that. They don't want to go to negative rates in the United States unless they absolutely have to in order to try to stimulate the economy. But they also see that we need better fiscal actions out of the government. So conclusions and questions. Yes, please work hard at Houghton. Make sure you are succeeding at being a human being, just at getting good grades, because it matters. And the macro side, we are uncharted territory on central bank interventions. It can help some short-term, but the long-term issues are daunting and they're worrisome. So, any questions?
Hi, my name is Kenny O'Hurk. I'm a business administration major and a senior. And my question was, with all that you do and all you have accomplished, how much has working with teams played a part in your success?
Good question. So I'm a very team-oriented person. There's definitely careers where it's less important. That's not my career. And I would say it is an invaluable skill set in the way I work, because I need people that work with me who can put themselves in other people's shoes, who can anticipate the needs of those around them and be proactive about it. I definitely work best in a group where everybody is kind of that way. I learned that pretty quick here at Houghton. I learned that in grad school working on team projects, because there's always some people who don't quite contribute. You kind of figure out who they are quick, and you don't want them on your team anymore. So, you know, it goes back to making connections with people. You know, the best team players are ones who anticipate people's needs and who are proactive about it and don't wait to be told what to do, for sure.
I work in career services, and when I heard you say that with AI, with one bank, that 1/3 of the positions could be eliminated very quickly, what would you say to our students about the best way to avoid being in a situation like that, where their job would be suddenly taken over by a machine?
Yeah, so that's a hard question because you're not always sure where AI fits in, and it'll change over time as AI becomes more powerful, right? So I think it goes back to one of the things I tried to talk about early, which was, sorry, bad technology. You have to make yourself essentially job-proof, which to me goes back to learning, critical thinking, and becoming a lifelong learner. So the answer is, you may pick out a career, and you may be all right for the next 10 years, but in year 11, it may be that your job is no longer needed because it can be done quicker, better, faster, more safely by technology. So what you have to do is be able to learn. Again, you got to have a skill set that's adaptable over time, and you have to constantly go back and reassess, right? So don't wait around till year 11. Be cognizant of what's going on in your area of work. So, I originally worked at a government job for 3 years. That was actually a good place for me to learn a lot to begin with, but also knew I couldn't be challenged at a government job forever, so I moved on to that. I went and worked after grad school. I went and worked at an investment bank doing sell-side equity research, but I pretty quickly figured out that a lot of the stuff I was doing was being commoditized over time, so then I switched over to the investing side. So don't wait around until you see your job go away. Understand what's going on in your business, read a lot, or in your career, even if it's not a business, if it's a not-for-profit, understand how your skill set fits the needs of the market and how that's changing over time, and don't wait till they say, sorry, we have to let you go. Go out, start training yourself for the next job, and again, that's why I don't envy you guys. It's going to be, I think, a lot harder for you than it was for me or the people who graduated with me, because everything is changing so fast, so you just have to be adaptable, and you've got to learn constantly. Sure.
Hi, I'm Steven. I'm a sophomore business administration major. You talked about some of the downsides of negative interest rates. What are some of the upsides of negative interest rates?
So if you're a consumer and you have a mortgage in Denmark, literally they pay you to hold the mortgage. So from that standpoint, sort of ignoring sustainability and what are the offsetting implications of that, on its face, like if you're a consumer in Denmark, like, hey, like I'm getting paid to take on debt. So that's one of the upsides. It does stimulate economic activity over a short period of time, but the question is, what does it do over the long term, given that it's sort of creating a weird incentive system that we really haven't operated in before. Maybe it all works out right, maybe one of the things I've learned over time is I have to keep assessing the data, and sometimes I need to change my mind, because that's how, on the investing world, that's how you minimize the cost of your mistakes and how you maximize the benefits of your good picks. But it may turn out that it's okay, but when I look at the example of Japan over time, it's maybe some of that problem is demographics, not just quantitative easing and running negative interest rates, but I have trouble believing that people being incented to consume and not save doesn't have some negative ongoing implications to how the economy works over time. But there's definite short-term positives for sure. And if you're one of the lucky people who had a mortgage that you thought you were going to have to pay interest on, and they're paying you to have the mortgage now, I guess that's a positive. You had a question?
Yeah, my name is Mary. I'm an international development major, and I was wondering, you talked a lot about the changes over the past 30 years within the market and everything and all those, but what can you describe maybe some of the constants and things that have stuck and worked well over the past couple of years?
Sure. So kind of going back to things I would like to know, going back to when I was originally at Houghton, build connections with people. I won't minimize the value of something like LinkedIn or some of the, technologically based ways of connecting with other people. But I will promise you the value of good personal connections massively outweigh the benefits you get from participating in an electronic network. So I don't know if that's directly answering your question, but that's sort of what I think you might be asking, is sort of like what lasts. And for me, what lasts is personal connections and relationships, partially for their intrinsic value, which is I'm a human being, I want to connect with other human beings and have a positive impact on their life. But it's also something that creates, if you think about an electronic network for, say, searching for a job, the great thing about that is it makes it so easy to apply to so many different jobs. So you might actually be able to get the computer to take your resume and apply to 700 different jobs, you know, across this region that you're interested in moving to. And that's definitely true, but that also enabled that exact same activity set for thousands and thousands of other people. So all of a sudden, you're one of, you know, literally thousands of applicants to a job, as opposed to I have a really strong connection with someone who's in this business, and he can put in, at least say, hey, look at this resume because I know this person and they're good, and that has so much more weight than something that came in through an electronic network. So electronic networks create ease of access and ease of information, but they actually also create over access as far as so many applicants for every single position that it's hard for the companies to really go through and pick the right people. So anything you could do from a connection standpoint to sort of reinforce your desire for a specific job is to be highly, highly valuable.
And I was also wondering more on the side of like economic-wise, like with the macroeconomics, was there, like, because you talked about like development of AI and like the changes in the central banking system, was there anything out of those that have stayed constant throughout the
Yeah, definitely. You know, when I think about from the investing side, yes, your technology matters, and yes, your your business position matters, and your brand matters, but management of a company is a constant that's stayed there since I started analyzing companies, and still is a constant today, which is a good management team knows their strengths, knows their weaknesses, watches their markets closely, adapts to changing situations, make sure they're not over-levered so that they don't get left in a bad spot at various points in the cycle. So a good manager is still worth their weight in gold, and I don't think that changes.
Thank you.
My name's Hope Barnes, and I'm a junior, and I'm a cultural studies major with a management minor. And I'm just wondering, speaking of connections and how we're making connections at Houghton, what were some ways that you made connections while you were here at Houghton, and how you continue to do that throughout your career?
So, you know, I'm not sure I'm the best at basic life skills. I try, but a lot of that is taking a genuine interest in the people around you, and to me, that's like a basic life skill. Like it's, you know, I remember Ken Bates, and you know, I don't know if he remembers me, but that has value. And taking a genuine interest in people and asking them how they're doing. And I know that sounds really stupid and basic, but it's not. And being genuine about it. And because again, like the strong friendships you develop over time are what really holds value through time. So both on the business side and on the personal side, it's just be honest with people, be real with people, and take genuine interest in others, and don't sort of sit in your own little bubble world where you're not looking around you and seeing what's really going on with the other people in your life.
Hi, I'm Emily. I work in the advancement office. So you talked about how there's the possibility that the United States will move toward negative interest rates, and that other global banks are moving or have already adapted that, and then that affects the yield of like bonds and whatnot. Does that concern you as an investor, like that bonds and other things like that could become too riskier that they wouldn't yield? And then do you have suggestions about what would be more secure or like better investments as an alternative that could potentially withstand all of the oscillation in the reserve?
Yeah, so I definitely have concerns because if I think about sort of valuing some kind of security or some type of investment, you know, traditionally I think about what the cash flows are that it can generate over time, what I think is the risk associated with that. And to oversimplify things, what's my DCF on my cash flows versus my risk-adjusted interest rate, right? When also, and you know, theoretically, a lot of the market's thinking about that too. Well, when the majority of the buying on any asset class is suddenly a central bank where their main purpose is not to make money on the asset, but just to buy in as much of the asset as possible, then I think it's a distorted pricing scheme, right? So what is the intrinsic value of that asset versus where it trades? There's some kind of gap there. I'm not sure exactly how much it is, but it makes the whole price discovery process of a market get impaired. To me, that sets us up for some really bad adjustment in asset prices down the road. Once central banks figure out they're not going to keep on doing this. So it definitely, so any of the sort of big publicly traded markets get the most affected first. So the big public debt markets have already been affected. I think there's been some follow-on impact into the equity markets. So for me, you know, trying to think about where can I hide in asset classes that are less affected, the answer is all asset classes are probably affected some, but I probably want to go into the private markets. I want to do private equity investments because the Federal Reserve isn't buying those and the Bank of Japan isn't buying those yet. So maybe the asset prices there are less distorted. So unfortunately, it kind of becomes a game of sort of where can I put my money where I feel like the asset prices are closer to where they should be, as opposed to where I think the asset prices are really attractive and can make, you know, my clients money over time. Great. Thanks for your time. Appreciate everybody, and happy to talk to anybody who wants to. I'll be around tomorrow for the BAB and leaving Saturday morning.
I found that really helpful and scary at the same time. Thank you very much, Adam. Please remember to take your dishes with you, and if you haven't filled out on the computer over there, the kiosk, then please do that as well. Thanks so much for coming.